So I thought we'd start out perhaps by each of us introducing ourselves and saying what we do, where we are, and then we can go to some basic questions. So I'll start off. I'm Daniel Barron, currently president of Daniel Barron Consulting, partner in Barron Family Wines with my son Sam, and former director of winemaking at Silver Oak, general manager at Dominus back in the day. Austin?
Howdy, everyone. Oui, hello, I'm Austin. In the accent that you guys are used to now. I'm Austin from Ovid. Been there from about 2006. Small spot. We just grow grapes and squish them up there.
I'm Toby Halkovich with Cake Bread Cellars. I'm director of vineyard operations, and I've been there since 2004.
Aaron Wenkoff, Spotswood Winery, also been there since 2006.
Hi, I'm Tegan Paslak with Turley Wine Cellars. Been there since 2003, and we work with about 50 vineyards in 12 counties throughout the state.
So I thought we'd start out, I think the basic, Thibaut went over it, the basic idea. He outlined his generalizations of the vintage. I think perhaps we could go into how we felt, each of you in your particular situations, if you thought that generalization represents what you experienced. I think any of us that lived through that series of vintages, I think 12 was really characterized by 10 and 11. I think we felt also blessed that we had something that was quasi-normal. But do you feel like, how in your situation, Austin, up on Pritchard Hill, do you think modifies what Thibaut described?
Yeah, I mean, the good old days, pre-global warming. I think that Thibaut pretty well summarized it in that it was just kind of like, yeah, that was a nice year. There weren't very many heat spikes. I think thinking back on that vintage, I think that what stands out most to me is really the harvest and how much your own personal decisions played a role in that year. And very much in response to even 9, 10, and 11, which all seemed like cool vintages. It was a year where it's kind of like, wow, I have all this luxury of time. Like, I could pick this now. There's no rain in the forecast. Why not wait a week? And so that seemed like that really kind of characterized the vintage, where since then nature has been a little bit more of a role, or played a bigger role in those harvest decisions. So, pass along.
Yeah, I think with the context of particularly 10 and kind of the meat grinder of 11, that 12, it certainly was a refreshing vintage to get back to that. I think, putting in context with the rain, it wasn't a lot, but the timing was almost perfect. We got that big rains in March, kind of filled all the soil profile up, and then it just gradually drained and brought that stress level up. I think that, we spent the first part of the vintage kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And after 9, 10, 11, we figured something was going to go wrong, and that never really happened. And so when I think of 12, I always think it was just a kind of a series of minor adjustments as we moved through the season. There wasn't that big heat spike. There wasn't that July or August rain to react to. And it was just kind of the just small series of adjustments.
Similar. It seemed kind of funny to be standing here after so many more extreme vintages, talking about the one vintage that was so moderate, but it was a vintage that had all of the moderating effects that we have grown to miss, and it was it was a large yield, and yield seems to be a variable that's not gotten ignored, but it is certainly pertinent to the conversation. Vegetative growth was also low. I did go through and look. Seemed that pruning weights were down probably 10-20% from 11. So you certainly saw the effects of the onset of drought. And yeah, then just, of course, like Austin was saying, the extended growing season giving us all the opportunities to hang ourselves.
I think the biggest thing that I saw was it was this kind of rebound vintage after 10 and 11. And I think I initially had such a good feeling about it because of this irrepressible mirth on every grower's face that year. You know, the calls, the one common thing was, I think we're going to need more bins. And after 10 and 11, I just feel like it kind of reset the tone. And I know I've said this to Daniel, but I think, you know, I compare it to being in two bad relationships and you get into one that just kind of seems normal and you're just elated that you're like, wow, this isn't crazy shit going on. And you start to think that it's the best thing ever based on the previous experience, where then maybe later you find out that wasn't the best thing ever.
So, Tegan, hold the mic for a second, because I also was curious. You source from so many different AVAs than most of us here. Did you see any particular differences in the different areas, or was it pretty consistently boring everywhere?
It was pretty consistently boring everywhere. You know, we specialize in Zinfandel and Old Vine Zinfandel, and I mean, a lot of the bigger companies, I mean, kind of crop estimates were, you know, 60% off. You know, even with the big guys. I mean, it was just way off. And these are people who that's what they spend their time and money doing. And, you know, just the berries never seem to stop growing. And we work with a lot of dry farm vineyards, so it kind of takes out and across, again, 12 counties. And I mean, the common theme was, you know, we dropped a lot of fruit and the berries kept growing. And I kind of questioned myself, well, did we cause that because we dropped too much fruit? And I still don't know the answer, but, you know, I think going back, we had Old Vine vineyards that, you know, we cut off at least 3 to 4 tons of fruit and we still got 4 tons to the acre. Dry farmed 90-year-old vineyards. So I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah, I think the next point that in my mind goes to is, now looking back 5 years later, to Tegan's point, I think we were so ecstatic having a boring year where things seemed to go our way. Did we overestimate the quality of 12 going back and tasting it now? I know when I taste that series of vintages, the 13 stands out to me as really the vintage that speaks. And so in hindsight, you know, how do you assess the quality of 12?
Yeah. I originally thought, yeah, we did overestimate the quality of 12. 12 seemed to be just a vintage that was as kind of moderate and easy as the wines tasted as moderate and easy as the vintage seemed to be. Going back, though, I think that obviously gives a gross disservice to the wine and the vintage. The wines right now are showing quite well, and I know I personally enjoy our own. Yeah, the only other thing that I was thinking too, just getting back to the idea of the different variables that enter in, is just that combination of relatively small canopy, what the 2011 vintage, that thumbprint of the late season waters and what that did on prenatal buds and bud development and crop yields for 2012, and how the 2 years always seem to pair together.
Yeah, the 11 spring probably didn't help bud fruitfulness in 12, although we had the high yields. Yeah.
Nobody wants it.
Toby?
No, I mean, I think that, you know, when you contrast it to 12 and 13, I mean, there are different years in the sense that the 12s we knew were nice wines kind of to begin with. And it seems like the 13s maybe took a little bit longer to start showing that. They're a little bit bigger wines. It's a little bit hotter year, and it just took a little bit more time. So to compare the two, 5 years ago, I think we would have said it was the 12s that we preferred. Now I think it's a little bit more of a toss-up.
Yeah, I don't have much to add in terms of the 12 or 13. Certainly, when after 11, 12 looked like the best vintage we've ever seen in our lives.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a disservice to 11, because I think 11s have actually turned out to be really great. But yeah, once you have 13 in the cellar, it was hard to ignore the quality of that vintage. I'd say though, if we look back over the last 5 years, 12 seems to kind of be the marker or the beginning of this series or run of vintages where we've had this kind of sugar ripening and then this break or this pause, which seems to follow year in, year out between that and when it's actually ready to harvest or phenological ripeness. So in terms of that run, I think that's an interesting thing to kind of ponder.
You think 12 was where we had the break, or 12 was the last vintage where we didn't?
Maybe it's just my time in the industry, but that feels like that was, in thinking back over the years, that feels like the first vintage where we really see this kind of consistent trend over the last 5 years. So I could be, some of the older folks might want to speak up to, and prove me wrong, but that's been my experience in recent memory. Or my memory is just really poor. We only got 5 years.
Tegan, anything to add?
Yeah, I think as soon as we started putting some blends together of the 13 wines and comparing them to the 2012s pre-bottling, I kind of thought, shoot, I really thought the 12s were great. And then you saw something in the 13s that were truly great, and it kind of put a frame of reference back right in your face that the 13s are truly, truly great wines. I mean, I could be shocked, but I can't imagine a better vintage in my lifetime with the yields we got, the way the harvest went, the quality of the wines. I mean, I can't imagine it all coming together like that.
Now looking back 5 years later, anything different that you would do, either in the vineyards or the winery with the 12? Might as well start with you.
I buy more tanks.
Yeah, right.
I think that was also the first year that, I think for a lot of people out there, and, all honesty, like a lot of times the yields kind of helped push your hand to winemaking, and it was more triage of which lots that you could kind of rip through fermentation and make some tank space, and which ones kind of you put up on a pedestal and you said these are going to be treated just the way, doesn't matter if we don't have the space or not, at least for us.
No, again, the ease at which 2012 seemed to be able to be managed in comparison to so many of the other vintages, it was hard to say, but it felt like it had a lot fewer lessons to actually teach. So no, not really.
Yeah, I mean, it's I agree. We didn't have to pull any major real levers in 2012. Again, it was kind of small adjustments. I mean, I think it was viticulturist. Most dangerous thing I did was walk through the cellar because of the yields. I wasn't the most popular guy at the winery.
Nah, I nailed it. If there's one thing, I think I might have picked just a touch earlier. It was after 11. It was kind of this. You had such opportunity, such flexibility with the weather and the year that you were given that I just kind of went and said, all right. Finally, I said, all right, let's pick it. But in hindsight, I think maybe I would have picked it a slight touch earlier. But.
So I imagine you guys probably tasted the wine before the seminar. Probably went back and reviewed. I know I would have. Did the wine taste the way you expected it to?
I'm going to pass on this because I actually didn't taste the wine. I'm looking forward to it, though. It's going to be good.
All right, after you taste it, let us know. Toby?
No, I'm in the same boat, yeah.
Oh, come on, guys. Help me here.
Well, no, I mean, we did talk about it a little bit earlier. I mean, it's not that we haven't tasted it recently, but again, yeah, it's particularly when you compare 12 and 13, it is, whereas the 13s have really kind of settled down. The 12s are still very elegant, but I don't think they're going to have the aging that the 13 does.
I was actually surprised. I thought that 12 was quite lively and showing really well. I originally thought it was a wine that would be more elegant and might actually fade away a little more quickly than some of its other siblings. But I was pleasantly surprised.
When Daniel had asked, I brought a wine actually from Amador County that, I kind of played to the crowd. The vineyard had twice its normal yield, but it was still only 2.8 tons to the acre. So, I mean, it's a 90-year-old vineyard, dry farmed, and amazing natural acidity. So to me, it actually was one of the teaching lessons in some vineyards that I think that vineyard in normal years, when it's say 1.25 tons to 1.5 tons to the acre, I actually wish we could have it at 2.5 to 3 tons to the acre most years. I feel like the wine can actually, and the grapes can develop a little more true hang time without overripeness.
Yeah, I was a little surprised looking at this, the Simis Oakville data, how cool 12 was. I mean, it's the coolest vintage other than 10 and 11. So in hindsight, you know, how do you know that it's going to stay cool, right? That you're not going to get a big VPD event around harvest. But, you know, perhaps thinking back on my experience, you know, I think, first of all, I would expect the anthocyanin peak and the sugar peak to be closer than we would get in 17 or 15. And I would expect to get softer tannins, so probably be able to go with a little more extraction without the danger of getting bitterness. But speaking for my wines, I think the 12s are showing as a vibrant, cooler vintage. I think the 13s have more depth and probably, well, it's tough to say if they'll have more ageability, but they definitely have more gravitas at this point. Do you guys have any questions for the panel? Boy, you guys have anything you want to add, or should we go taste wine? Well, thank you.
My only question
Go
is
ahead.
if anyone else saw a similar thing. I mean, again, our usual range for, you know, Eurasian cluster weights, we do a multiplier of 1.2 to 1.4, and it usually works throughout the state, where in 2012 we were seeing things that were, you know, 2 times what we were getting at our Eurasian cluster weight, something we've never seen before, you know, and it doesn't really seem, no one's really ever explained it to me what really went on, that we still had cluster and berry growth, you know, that late in the season. Anyone out there that has a good idea of what kind of happened? I mean, and the interesting thing is, you know, we had a lot of this happen in dry farmed vineyards with zero irrigation, and the berries just continued to grow, I think, up until we picked them. It's the only way we got them to stop growing.
Wasn't there like an inch of rain right at like berry sizing in 2012? We got through bloom, berries were pea-sized, and there was a, like middle of June, July, and there was 1 inch of rain.
Right.
Yeah, my records show it was in late May. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Bloom.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where I thought that all that excess berry sizing came in, because it rained so much. It's like throwing 24 hours of irrigation on your grapes and you get 1 inch of rain.
Well, should we go taste some wine?
Helen has a question.
Helen.
I was just thinking also, like, the temperatures were so moderate, maybe we were just in the sweet spot of. Sorry, the temperatures were just so moderate that whole summer, maybe there wasn't anything that was stopping or interrupting the, you know, the berry size increase.
Well, that's
Just
my
like the-
theory, and
Yeah.
you know, I kind of think the vintage didn't have any like teachable moments in life to add like complexity to a, like what you'd see in a human being. They never had those stressors that you kind of can develop, you know, personality from.
The Suffering Builds Character School of Viticulture.
Another question.
Yeah, I got a question real quick. I dealt with a lot of botrytis in 12, primarily in Old Vines Inn. I'm curious, Tegan, if you had any of that, and if you noticed any of that in the wines, if you did.
We only had it in one vineyard, but that vineyard had some other issues that it had mite issues, so it kind of hung out there later than we would have liked it to. But I mean, there was only one vineyard that we had in northern Calistoga that had botrytis issues. But most of our old vines are all strictly dry farm, not even irrigation up there to do what we need to do.
Yeah, considering the cold conditions in 2012 compared to 13, 14, 15. Do you feel when you test 12 versus 13 or 14 that those relatively colder temperatures have modified the aroma profile and also affected the aging in a way that 13, 14, and 15 do not show?
Well, I think that was probably one of the reasons I personally fell in love with the 12s, or I believed I fell in love with the 12s, was because of that. I just don't know if the wines on a whole have the stuffing to see that through.
Okay.
I think you get, at least in ours, you can get a little bit more of the methoxypyrazine, but it's quite subtle. And the other thing too, I know a lot of the conversations about, it should be a cooler vintage, more natural acid. Valley Floor, we don't see a lot of acid, whether it was 11, 12, 13, 14. We probably saw more acid in 17 than natural acid. So there's other things still going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to the winemakers on that one.
I'd say, I think the profile of 12 is generally pretty fresh and vibrant. Interestingly, I find a lot of similarities between 12 and 14, not necessarily in the freshness and the vibrancy, but the weight and density of those wines. But yeah, it could just be the yields. It could be, I'm not entirely sure what the connection is there, but I'm curious to see, maybe with this better predicting, that we can kind of start to have qualitative assessment of the growing degree days as we go through the season and have a better idea of why is 12 different than 13, 13's different than 14, and so on. So,
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize. I do feel that the aromatics in 12 have a freshness to them, but I certainly wouldn't characterize 13, 14, and 15 together as a group. I would tend to put 14 and 15 together more than throw 13 with them, especially with the earliness of those harvests. But yeah, I think 12 retained a kind of a freshness, and maybe that slight hint of pyrazines that with aging gives a sense of vibrancy.
And is it good for aging potential or bad, you think?
Well, I'll
Bordeaux,
start. I thought Aaron. Well, I thought what Aaron said was very cogent, because although we would expect with that cooler year to have lower pH, I don't remember seeing that. So on the surface, you'd say, okay, a cooler year is going to age better because of the lower pH, and that will compensate for the lack of tannins. But I don't know that was the case. I think it's going to age fine. I think 13 will have another 5 years on it, but I think 12 is not going to be a wimp in terms of ageability.
I concur. I think that's, pretty well sums it up. I think the wines are really charming and nicely balanced. But yeah, 13 is going to have 5 to 10 years on it for sure. But they should age beautifully for the foreseeable future.
Right.
Yeah, I think we saw it in 13. The tannins just had a little bit more phenolics to it, a little bit higher tannins to begin with, and so I think that's going to help as well.
Are we still talking methoxypyrazines? Yeah. Well, I like a little bit. It'll be fine for the aging.
Well,
Any other questions?
have we covered it?
Sure.
Thank you all for having us here, and let's drink some wine.